What if the entire way we understand the human mind, our dreams, our fears, our hidden desires, could be traced back to a single curious boy growing up in the heart of 19th century Europe? That boy was born Sigmund Freud on the 6th of May, 1856, in the small town of Freiburg, Moravia, a place that today sits within the borders of the Czech Republic. Few people in that provincial town could have imagined that this child would one day reshape psychology, literature, philosophy, and how ordinary people talk about themselves. So how exactly did it happen? Let's go back to the beginning. Freud's family was Jewish, and his father Jacob was a wool merchant of modest means. When Sigmund was just 4 years old, the family relocated to Vienna, the glittering imperial capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was there that he would spend the better part of his life. From the very start, Freud was an exceptional student. He graduated at the top of his class and entered the University of Vienna in 1873, initially drawn toward the natural sciences. His intellectual appetite was extraordinary. He wasn't content with just one discipline. Alongside his medical coursework, he attended lectures by the philosopher Franz Brentano, whose ideas about the nature of consciousness and intentionality left a quiet but lasting impression on him. The most formative influence of his university years, however, was Ernst von Bruck, a towering figure in physiology who ran one of Europe's most rigorous research laboratories. Under Bruck, Freud spent years examining nervous tissue under the microscope, developing the precise, systematic habits of mind that would later define his theoretical work. He earned his medical degree in 1881, and though he was genuinely gifted in neurological research, practical financial pressures pushed him toward clinical medicine. He needed to earn a living, and soon enough, he needed to support a family. But before marriage, there came controversy. In 1884, Freud published a paper enthusiastically endorsing cocaine as a therapeutic drug, promoting its potential to treat depression and morphine addiction. For a brief moment, it seemed like a breakthrough. The reality, however, was far more complicated. A close friend of his became seriously addicted to cocaine after Freud recommended it as a treatment, and the scandal that followed damaged Freud's professional reputation. He quietly stepped back from his advocacy, and cocaine faded from his work. The episode is a revealing one. It shows us a young scientist eager for recognition, willing to take intellectual risks, but not yet possessing the caution that experience would later teach him. The truly decisive turning point came in 1885 and 1886, when Freud traveled to Paris to study under Jean-Martin Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Charcot was the most celebrated neurologist in the world at the time, and his work with patients suffering from hysteria was unlike anything Freud had encountered in Vienna. Charcot was using hypnosis to induce and relieve hysterical symptoms, demonstrating that these physical complaints, paralysis, blindness, convulsions, had no detectable neurological cause. They were, in some profound sense, products of the mind. This was a revelation. Freud returned to Vienna fundamentally transformed. The body and the brain were not the whole story. Something invisible, something psychological, was at work beneath the surface of human behavior. Back in Vienna, his personal life took shape alongside his professional ambitions. In 1886, he married Martha Bernays, a woman he had courted through a long and passionate correspondence during their engagement. Together they would have 6 children, and their household became the backdrop against which Freud conducted some of the most consequential intellectual work in modern history. Raising a large family while building a private practice and pursuing theoretical breakthroughs was no small feat, and the domestic stability Martha provided gave Freud the foundation he needed. Their youngest daughter, Anna Freud, would go on to become a pioneering psychoanalyst in her own right. It was around this time that Freud began a deeply productive collaboration with the Viennese physician Joseph Breuer. Breuer had been treating a young woman known in the literature as Anna O. whose mysterious symptoms, including paralysis and memory disturbances, seemed to ease when she was encouraged to talk about them. She herself called it the talking cure, and the phrase stuck. Freud and Breuer developed these observations into a formal framework, and in 1895 they co-authored Studies on Hysteria, a work that marks one of the clearest birth certificates of psychoanalysis. The idea was radical, that bringing unconscious thoughts and buried memories into conscious awareness through sustained conversation between patient and physician could actually relieve suffering. The collaboration with Breuer eventually ended, partly due to theoretical disagreements about the role of sexuality in neurosis. But Freud pressed forward alone. He turned inward, conducting what he described as his own self-analysis, examining his dreams, his memories, and his desires with the same clinical rigor he applied to his patients. The result was published in 1899 and released in early 1900 under the title The Interpretation of Dreams. The book argued that dreams are not random noise, but meaningful expressions of unconscious wishes, and it introduced the technique of free association, encouraging patients to speak without censorship whatever comes to mind, as the royal road into the unconscious. The book sold slowly at first, misunderstood by many and dismissed by some, but it contained the seeds of an entirely new way of understanding what it means to be human. From a curious boy in Moravia to the author of one of the most influential books of the 20th century, the journey had been marked by brilliant intuitions, painful setbacks, and an almost obsessive drive to understand what lies beneath the surface of the human mind. And this was only the beginning. By the early 1900s, Freud was no longer simply a Viennese physician with unconventional theories. He was becoming something far larger, a thinker whose ideas were beginning to seep into the foundations of modern culture itself. And the decade that followed the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams would see those ideas expand, institutionalize, and reach audiences that Freud himself could never have anticipated. In 1905, he published 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, a work that remains one of the most controversial and consequential texts in the history of psychology. In it, Freud laid out his concept of infantile sexuality, the deeply uncomfortable argument that sexual life does not begin at puberty, but has roots in earliest childhood. He elaborated the Oedipus complex, the idea that children experience unconscious desires toward the opposite sex parent and rivalry with the same-sex parent, a dynamic he saw as foundational to personality development. These ideas were deeply unsettling to Victorian and Edwardian sensibilities, and they drew fierce criticism. But they also electrified a generation of thinkers across medicine, literature, anthropology, and philosophy. Psychoanalytic thinking was expanding far beyond the consulting room. Freud continued to develop and refine his theoretical framework across the following decades. Later works, including Civilization and Its Discontents, published in 1930, pushed his ideas into genuinely new territory, applying psychoanalytic thinking not just to individuals but to entire societies. In that book, he argued that human civilization itself is built on the suppression of instinctual drives, and that this repression is the hidden engine of both cultural achievement and collective suffering. It was an audacious idea, and it cemented Freud's reputation not merely as a clinician, but as a major intellectual voice on the human condition. Crucially, Freud understood that ideas need institutions to survive and grow. In 1908, he founded what was initially called the Wednesday Psychological Society, a gathering of colleagues and disciples who met regularly at his home to discuss psychoanalytic theory and clinical cases. Within 2 years, this informal group was formalized as the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, with Freud at its helm as president. The institutionalization of psychoanalysis did not stop in Vienna. International congresses brought together practitioners from across Europe and beyond. Psychoanalysis crossed the Atlantic, finding enthusiastic reception in the United States after Freud delivered a celebrated series of lectures at Clark University in Massachusetts in 1909. It took root in Britain, Germany, and Hungary. A movement had been born, and its reach would only continue to grow. The recognition that came with this influence was significant. In 1930, Freud was awarded the Goethe Prize, one of the most prestigious cultural honors in the German-speaking world, given for distinguished contributions to psychology and German literary culture. It was a powerful signal of his stature, not just as a scientist, but as a figure who had genuinely shaped how educated people thought and wrote and imagined themselves. By this point, Sigmund Freud was not simply a famous doctor. He was a cultural institution. But the final years of his life were shadowed by two forces that no intellectual achievement could hold at bay: physical suffering and political catastrophe. In 2023, Freud was diagnosed with a malignant tumor of the jaw, almost certainly the consequence of his lifelong habit of cigar smoking, which by his own account he found nearly impossible to abandon. What followed was 16 years of extraordinary hardship. He underwent more than 30 operations on his jaw and mouth, endured chronic and often debilitating pain, and was forced to wear a prosthetic device that made eating and speaking profoundly difficult. Yet through all of it, he continued to work. He continued to see patients, to write, to correspond. The sheer discipline required to maintain that level of intellectual output in the face of such physical torment is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Then came 1938, and with it a threat that was existential in an entirely different sense. In March of that year, Nazi Germany annexed Austria in the event known as the Anschluss, and the danger facing Jewish citizens, including Freud and his family, became immediate and unmistakable. Freud was initially reluctant to leave Vienna, the city that had been his home for nearly 80 years. But the reality of Nazi persecution made departure not just advisable but necessary. It was the intervention of two key figures that made his escape possible. Princess Marie Bonaparte, his patient and devoted supporter, used her considerable influence and resources to help secure the family's exit. Ernest Jones, the Welsh physician who had championed psychoanalysis across Britain, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to arrange refuge in England. On the 6th of June, 1938, Freud arrived in London. He was 82 years old, seriously ill, and had just been forced to flee the city he had called home for most of his life. And yet, characteristically, he kept working. He settled at 20 Maresfield Gardens in the Hampstead neighborhood of London, where he received visitors, continued a limited clinical practice, and completed his final major work, Moses and Monotheism, as well as leaving behind an unfinished manuscript known as the Outline of Psychoanalysis. The house at Maresfield Gardens is today the Freud Museum, preserving his famous consulting room, his library, and the remarkable collection of antiquities he had gathered over a lifetime, a place where visitors can still stand in the presence of the mind that changed how the modern world thinks about itself. By September 1939, the jaw cancer had progressed beyond endurance. True to an agreement he had made with his personal physician, Max Schur, Freud was administered morphine and died peacefully on the 23rd of September 1939, at the age of 83. He was cremated, and his ashes were interred at Golders Green Cemetery in London. More than 8 decades on, the debate over Freud's legacy has never fully settled, and perhaps that is exactly as it should be. Was he a visionary who unlocked the hidden architecture of the human mind, or a flawed theorist whose ideas don't hold up under scientific scrutiny? The honest answer is probably that he was both. So here is the question worth sitting with. Which of Freud's ideas do you think still matter, and which ones should we leave behind? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The conversation Freud started is still very much alive.